Graduation day was supposed to feel like an ending and a beginning all at once, but for me, it was neither. The morning sun felt too bright, too honest, exposing everything I didn't want people to see. My cheap suit, my worn shoes, the quiet panic sitting behind my practiced smile. Around me, laughter spilled like music. Parents carried bouquets, mothers cried, fathers clapped their sons on the back. Everywhere I looked, pride bloomed like banners. I told myself I didn't mind standing alone. I'd been doing that for most of my life. As my name was called, I walked across the stage, pretending not to notice the empty seat where my father should have been. My classmates waved to their families, pointing, laughing, celebrating futures already paved for them. I gripped my diploma so tightly it wrinkled, as if pressure alone could keep the ache from spilling out. When I reached my seat again, my phone buzzed. One new message. From him. I hesitated before unlocking the screen. Maybe, just maybe, he'd changed his mind. Maybe he was proud. Maybe there was still a fragment of the father I'd once imagined him to be. But the words hit like a slap. Don't expect help from me anymore. You're on your own, that was it. No congratulations. No, I'm proud of you. Just a final, deliberate cut. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, and the cheers around me turned into distant noise. The message wasn't new, not really. It was the same thing he'd told me my whole life, just now in writing. Still, seeing it there made it feel like a verdict. I was officially disowned, not just emotionally, but existentially. I put my phone face down and clapped for the next graduate, smiling like nothing had happened. Inside, something cracked open. It wasn't pure pain. It was sharper, quieter, almost clean, a kind of resolve that didn't ask for comfort. For years, I'd begged for scraps of his approval, shaped every achievement around the hope that he'd notice. But that text made something clear. He never would. After the ceremony, I stood on the lawn watching parents take pictures, their arms wrapped around the people they'd raised. I lingered at the edge, pretending to check my messages. A friend shouted my name, waving his phone. "Your dad didn't make it?" he asked, like it was small talk. I shrugged. Busy, probably. He offered a sympathetic smile, then rushed back to his family. I watched them pile into a luxury SUV, laughing, before disappearing down the hill. The crowd thinned. The balloons began to deflate, and I was still standing there, clutching the diploma that suddenly felt heavier than any textbook I'd ever carried. My phone buzzed again, this time a notification from the bursar's office. Final tuition balance, paid in full by student loans. My father hadn't contributed a cent. I stared at that confirmation and realized the truth. He'd wanted me to fail, to crawl back so he could say, "I told you so." Instead, I smiled. Maybe this was freedom, disguised as rejection. Maybe being cut off was the only way I'd ever learned to build without permission. The thought scared me. But it also sparked something, like the flick of a lighter in the dark. As the campus emptied, I walked toward the parking lot. My car was the same dented hatchback I'd been fixing for years, the muffler barely hanging on. I sat inside, started the engine, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't look like success. I looked like someone about to disappear, and maybe that was fine. Before driving off, I opened my phone one last time. The message still glared back at me. "Don't expect help from me anymore." I typed a reply, then deleted it. He didn't deserve a reaction. Instead, I whispered into the quiet car, "I won't need your help." That day, I drove away from the campus, from the version of me that used to wait for him. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew one thing for sure. Someday, I'd make sure he regretted sending that message, and when that day came, I wouldn't need to say a word. When I think back to the house I grew up in, it never feels like home, just a place where I learned how to stay small. It was a 2-story monument to everything my father valued: order, success, appearances. Every photo on the wall featured my older brother, Daniel. His trophies, his graduation photos, his perfect smile. My own pictures were shoved into a drawer somewhere, if they existed at all. Dad used to say, "Daniel's the real successor." He said it so often it became the rhythm of our household, the background music of my childhood. Every dinner, every family event, every moment of silence, it always led back to Daniel. When he got straight A's, Dad threw a barbecue. When I got straight A's, he nodded once and said, "Good. That's what you're supposed to do." I remember standing at the top of the stairs one summer morning, listening to them pack for a trip to Lake Tahoe. I'd been told we couldn't afford for everyone to go, so I stayed behind. Later that night, I found a photo of them smiling on the dock, all three of them wearing matching jackets. I stared at that picture for hours, tracing their faces with my thumb. I didn't cry. I just felt hollow, like I was a guest in my own family. Mom tried to soften things sometimes, sneaking me extra dessert or patting my hair when Dad wasn't looking, but even she obeyed the unspoken rule. Don't challenge him. If Daniel broke something, Dad would chuckle and say, "Boys will be boys." If I made the same mistake, I'd hear my name shouted from across the house like a curse. "You'll never be like your brother," he'd roar. Eventually, I stopped trying. I became quiet, observant. I learned how to disappear into corners and watch, to see the cracks in his perfect image. He thought dominance was strength. I saw insecurity. He thought his praise was power. I learned it was currency, and I was broke. Every time he dismissed me, a small part of me built something invisible inside. Resistance. The day I realized he didn't love me, not really, was the day Daniel crashed Dad's car. It was a new model, his pride and joy. When I heard the crunch of metal outside, I ran to help, my heart pounding. Daniel stumbled out unhurt but shaken. Dad stormed out seconds later, his face red with rage. For a split second, his eyes landed on me and I saw it happen. The shift. The decision. "What did you do?" he shouted. I froze. It wasn't me, but it didn't matter. He needed a target and I was always convenient. Later, after the shouting stopped, Daniel found me in my room. He looked guilty but didn't defend me. "You know how he gets," he whispered. I nodded, though I wanted to scream. That night, I packed a small bag. I didn't run away, not physically, but something in me did. I stopped chasing his approval. I started chasing proof. Proof that I could outgrow the walls of that house, that I could build something that didn't require his blessing. Still, the scars ran deep. Even years later, when someone praised me, I'd wait for the correction that always came after. When someone offered kindness, I'd brace for withdrawal. That house trained me to expect rejection as naturally as breathing. Sometimes I dream about walking through those old rooms. The polished floors, the heavy furniture, the smell of my father's cologne lingering in the hallway. I see my childhood self sitting on the stairs, waiting for someone to notice me. And I want to tell him, "You're not invisible. You're just in the wrong place." But back then I didn't know that. I only knew how to survive by silence, by working harder, by pretending indifference. He thought he'd broken me. What he didn't realize was that he was teaching me how to endure. Every punishment became a lesson. Every exclusion became fuel. Every lie about my worth became a quiet vow. Someday, I'll prove you wrong. When I left that house for college, he barely looked up from his newspaper. "Don't waste your time studying business," he said. "Daniel will take over the company." I remember standing at the door, suitcase in hand, saying nothing. For the first time, I didn't ask for his blessing. I didn't even want it. The house behind me was big, but it was empty, emptier than I'd ever be again. And as I walked away, I knew that one day, I wouldn't need to knock on that door ever again. I still remember the smell of Dad's office that day. Leather, cigar smoke, and expensive failure. He was sitting behind his oak desk, framed by walls covered in photos of Daniel standing next to businessmen I'd only ever seen on magazine covers. I'd come home from college with a mix of fear and excitement, clutching my laptop like it held my future. I'd been developing a startup idea, a platform that helped small local suppliers reach major retailers. I believed in it. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. It solved a problem I'd seen firsthand in the part-time jobs I'd taken just to survive college. I stood there, heart racing, while Dad barely looked up. "Make it quick," he said, tapping his pen. So I did. I poured everything out, the market gap, the growth model, the way tech could bridge the divide for small businesses like the ones he always dismissed. For a few minutes, I forgot who I was talking to. I was confident, passionate, alive. Then he laughed. Not a polite chuckle. a deep, cutting laugh that filled the room like smoke. "You?" he said, shaking his head. "You can't even manage your life, and you want to manage a company?" The words hit harder than any insult he'd ever thrown, because this time, I'd shown him something of myself, not grades or chores, but a dream. And he crushed it casually, like it was nothing. Daniel was standing near the door, arms crossed, smirking. "Dad's just being realistic," he said. "You've got a lot to learn before anyone invests in your ideas." I wanted to argue, to defend what I'd built, but I felt my throat tighten. My hands trembled. I just nodded and closed my laptop, slowly, carefully, because I didn't want them to see how much it hurt. I walked out of that office, each step heavier than the last, until I was back in my old car outside, staring at the steering wheel. I sat there for hours, replaying his words. "You can't manage your life," and he was right in a way. My life had been defined by his rules, his hierarchy, his approval. I'd spent years trying to prove myself on his terms, grades, achievements, appearances. But that day, I realized his approval wasn't worth earning. That was my breaking point. Not the yelling, not the favoritism, not the trips I was left out of. This. The laughter. The dismissal. It was the sound of a door closing, and behind it every ounce of validation I'd ever begged for. I drove back to campus that night and withdrew the little money I had left. I sold my car within a week and used the cash to buy a second-hand laptop and pay for a tiny studio apartment that smelled like damp wood and desperation. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I stopped calling home. I didn't visit for holidays. When Mom texted, I answered politely but briefly. I couldn't handle the pity in her words, the quiet apologies she'd never dare say aloud. I didn't need apologies. I needed results. Every sleepless night after that, I worked on my idea. I coded, researched, networked, failed, rebuilt, and failed again. When the screen glowed at 3 a.m., I felt something I'd never felt before: freedom. The kind that doesn't come from being accepted, but from knowing you don't need to be. Still, their laughter echoed in my head, driving me like fuel. "You can't even manage your life." Maybe not then. But I was learning. Every mistake was a class, every rejection a lesson. There were nights when I'd sit by my single window, watching the city lights flicker, imagining them as possibilities. Somewhere out there were people like me, underestimated, overlooked, and done waiting for permission. I promised myself I'd never go back to that office, never beg him to see me again. I didn't know it yet, but that vow would shape everything, every deal I made, every risk I took, every wall I broke through. That moment, his laughter, was the last gift he ever gave me. Because from that day forward, I stopped asking for help. And years later, when the world finally took me seriously, I'd remember that sound, his mocking laugh, and realize it was the echo of my own beginning. Those were the years my stomach growled louder than my ambition. And yet, I kept going. I worked in the back of a cafe during the day, stacking deliveries and cleaning tables until my hands cracked from the detergent. At night, I delivered food for extra cash, sometimes to offices that reminded me of everything I was trying to build. There were nights when I'd drive around aimlessly, too exhausted to go home, too broke to afford the gas to keep moving. So I'd park behind a 24-hour convenience store, recline the seat of my rusted hatchback, and call it a bed. My car smelled like instant noodles and spilled coffee, my perfume of survival. Each morning, I'd open my laptop before dawn, coding in the dim light, whispering to myself that this was temporary. But temporary stretched into years. Rejection emails became a routine. Some investors didn't even bother replying. Others would schedule meetings, let me pitch my heart out, then laugh politely and say, "You seem passionate, but this isn't scalable." That word, scalable, started to feel like a weapon. It meant we don't believe in you. Still, I couldn't stop. Every failure became another nail in the armor I was forging around my heart. I was too proud to admit how bad it got. How I'd sometimes sneak into the cafe's restroom to wash up, or how I'd chew gum to quiet the hunger when I couldn't afford dinner. I told myself I was paying my dues, that one day I'd tell this story and make it sound brave instead of desperate. Loneliness was the worst of it. There's a kind of silence that settles in when no one's waiting for you. Not out of anger, but indifference. I'd see friends posting pictures with their families, celebrating birthdays, weddings, promotions. I didn't resent them. I just wished for a second that someone would text me, "Proud of you." But no one did. It's strange, though. In that emptiness, kindness found me in small ways. The cafe owner, Mr. Patel, started leaving leftover pastries by the back door, by accident. He never said anything, just winked when I thanked him. A security guard at the co-working space where I sometimes snuck in after hours began letting me stay a little longer, saying hard work shouldn't have a curfew. Once, on a rainy night, my car battery died, and I stood helpless in the downpour. A stranger from a nearby building saw me struggling and helped jumpstart it. Before leaving, he said, "You look like someone who's gonna make it. Just don't quit before you do." That line stayed with me longer than he probably expected. I started collecting moments like that, small proofs that the world wasn't entirely cruel. Each one softened the bitterness my family had planted in me. I learned to measure value differently. Not in approval, but in resilience. Not in inheritance, but in endurance. There were nights I'd stare at the cracked ceiling of my car and whisper business plans like prayers. Every new feature I built felt like a lifeline thrown into an ocean of uncertainty. Some nights I wanted to quit, but quitting would mean proving my father right. I couldn't give him that satisfaction. One winter I got pneumonia. I kept working anyway, shivering under my coat while the glow of my laptop kept me company. When I finally collapsed at work, Mr. Patel drove me to the hospital himself. He paid part of the bill, too. I tried to refuse, but he just said, "You'll pay it forward one day." And I did, though it would take years before I could. Slowly, painfully, things began to shift. A small logistics firm agreed to beta test my platform. The system crashed twice, nearly losing me the deal, but they liked my persistence. "You don't give up easily, do you?" the manager said. I didn't. I couldn't. I started making just enough to move out of my car and into a room barely big enough for a bed and a desk. But to me, it felt like a penthouse. I celebrated with a $2 cup of ramen and a playlist called Revenge Fuel. Every scar, every hunger pang, every sleepless night built something in me that comfort never could. I wasn't just building a company. I was rebuilding myself. The son who once begged for approval was gone. The man who remained didn't need applause, only results. Those hunger years stripped me down to nothing. And in that nothingness, I found the kind of strength no inheritance could buy. It happened on a night when I almost gave up. I'd been turned down by yet another investor that morning, a polite, condescending man who told me, "You're hardworking, but this isn't Silicon Valley," as if location determined destiny. I walked out of that meeting with my pride shredded, but my resolve, somehow, still flickering. That evening, an email arrived from someone I hadn't heard from in years, Professor Malik, my old economics lecturer. He'd always been the kind who noticed effort more than grades. His message was simple. "Still chasing that logistics idea? I might know someone you should meet." I didn't dare get my hopes up, but I showed up the next day at a modest cafe where he was waiting with a man in his late 40s, neatly dressed, with a calm, analytical stare. His name was Mr. Conway. He listened quietly as I explained the concept, the platform connecting small vendors to larger distribution networks, then asked for a demo. My hands trembled as I opened my laptop. The interface was basic, held together by stubbornness and caffeine, but it worked. When the first transaction successfully logged, Conway smiled, not wide, not theatrical, just enough to make my heart skip. "It's rough," he said, "but the idea's solid. You remind me of myself 20 years ago." He didn't laugh. He didn't lecture. He didn't compare me to anyone else. He simply said, "I'll give you $25,000. It's not much, but if you're as serious as you sound, it'll be enough to start." I nearly forgot how to breathe. For months, I'd lived on less than that. Suddenly, the impossible looked possible. I wanted to hug him, but I settled for a firm handshake that probably revealed how badly I was shaking. That night, I sat in my car again. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to remember. I looked up at the roof that had once been my ceiling and whispered, "This is the last time I'll ever beg." And I meant it. Within a week, I'd signed the paperwork, opened a business account, and registered the company under a name that meant everything to me: Bridgeworks. It symbolized what I'd always wanted to build, not just a tech platform, but a bridge between rejection and recognition, invisibility and impact. I rented a tiny office in a shared workspace downtown. It was barely the size of my old bedroom, but when I turned the key for the first time, it felt like unlocking a new life. The walls were bare, the lights too harsh, the furniture mismatched. But it was mine. No one could tell me to leave. No one could belittle me there. I worked from sunrise to midnight, building, testing, fixing bugs, and calling potential clients with a confidence I didn't know I had. Each email that started with, "We're interested," felt like a heartbeat coming back to life. Professor Malik dropped by once, bringing coffee and quiet encouragement. "Don't forget what you're made of," he said before leaving. I didn't. I couldn't. Conway became more than an investor. He became a mirror. He didn't coddle me, but he believed in the version of me that could deliver. When I failed, he said, "Good. Learn fast." When I succeeded, he simply said, "Keep going." It was the mentorship I'd craved my entire life. Not control, not ego, just belief. The first time I printed the company logo and taped it to the glass door, I stared at it for a long time. The letters looked foreign, unreal, like they belonged to someone else. But they were mine now. That night, walking home under the city lights, I caught my reflection in a store window. Tired, thinner than I'd been in years, but smiling. Not because I'd made it, but because, finally, I was on my own path. The spark had been lit. Small, fragile, but unstoppable. Success, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It sneaks in quietly, then threatens to leave just as fast. 6 months after that first spark, Bridgeworks had started to attract attention. A handful of small distributors were on board, a few glowing testimonials rolled in, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to breathe. For once, I wasn't chasing survival. I was chasing growth. Then, just as momentum began to build, the email came. Our largest investor, a logistics firm that had promised a major partnership, backed out. No warning, no explanation beyond strategic realignment. In plain terms, we were done for. Their funding had been the lifeline paying for our servers, rent, and 2 interns who'd believed in my vision enough to work for almost nothing. I stared at the email for so long that the words blurred. For days, I felt that same hollowness I'd known as a kid, the kind that came from being forgotten. My hands shook as I told my tiny team we might have to close. They nodded silently. They were young, hopeful, and now I was about to crush their belief the same way my father had crushed mine. That night, alone in the office, I scrolled through my phone and, against my better judgment, opened my father's contact. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but some wounded, desperate part of me wanted him to know what I was facing. Not for help, just acknowledgement. I sent a short message. Company hit a wall. Investor pulled out. Might need to start over. His reply came faster than I expected. Told you. You were never built for business. Some people learn too late. It was like being punched through time. Every word from that message dragged me back to the office years ago. His laugh, Daniel's smirk, the humiliation. I dropped the phone on the desk and just stared at the darkness outside the window. The city looked so alive, so indifferent. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat there surrounded by empty coffee cups and silence, watching the cursor blink on the screen like a heartbeat daring me not to give up. Somewhere between rage and exhaustion, something inside me shifted. I remembered that night in my car when I'd whispered, "This is the last time I'll ever beg." And I realized this collapse, wasn't an ending. It was the test of that promise. So I made a decision. If the old version of Bridgeworks was dying, I'd burn it down myself and build something better. I opened every line of code, tore apart every feature, every process, every assumption we'd made. I stopped trying to impress investors and started asking what the users actually needed. For 2 straight weeks, I barely left the office. I slept, under my desk, living on vending machine snacks and caffeine. The interns came back, unpaid, just to help. "We believe in you," one of them said quietly one morning. It broke me. Not because of pity, but because someone for the first time saw value in me without conditions. We rebuilt the entire system from the ground up. The new platform wasn't just a marketplace. It offered real-time supply chain analytics for small vendors, something even the big players hadn't streamlined yet. It was bolder, smarter, faster. When the new version launched, something wild happened. Traction. Users began signing up organically. Small businesses tweeted about it. Industry forums picked it up. Within a month, we had more engagement than in our entire first year. The very investor who'd pulled out sent a casual "hope things are well" email. I didn't reply. Instead, I sent an update to Professor Malik and Mr. Conway. A short note with the new metrics and a thank you line. Conway called me that evening. "You took a hit and came back swinging," he said. "That's what separates survivors from builders." But it wasn't about survival anymore. It was defiance. I wasn't just building a company. I was rewriting my identity. A few weeks later, my father texted again. "Heard your startup's still running. Surprising." I stared at that word, surprising, and almost laughed. I typed, then deleted a dozen replies before settling on one sentence. "You taught me what not to be. Thanks for that." Then I blocked his number. That night, for the first time, I didn't feel small when I looked out at the skyline. I felt powerful, not because I'd won yet, but because I'd stopped needing permission to fight. The collapse had been my crucible. What came out wasn't desperation anymore. It was fire. The first real win didn't come with fireworks. It came in the form of a spreadsheet. Numbers finally turned from red to black, and for a long moment I just stared at them in disbelief. Break even. It wasn't profit yet, but it meant survival. After years of scraping, failing, rebuilding, we were finally standing on solid ground. The day it happened, the office felt different. The walls that once echoed with tension now buzzed with energy. My 2 interns, now full-time employees, cheered like we'd just won the Super Bowl. I smiled, trying to act calm, but when I stepped outside, I let the laughter break free. I'd spent years chasing validation, and now the numbers were my proof. No father's approval required. A week later, something extraordinary happened. One of our vendor success stories went viral. A small family-run supplier had used Bridgeworks to land a contract with a national retailer, and the story spread across social media like wildfire. "From garage to global," the article headline read, featuring a screenshot of our platform in the background. Overnight, our inbox exploded. New users flooded the site. Tech blogs started reaching out for interviews. Suddenly, we weren't the underdog startup anymore. We were the disruptor to watch. I didn't know how to process it. I kept expecting it to fade, for someone to pull the rug again, but this time, it didn't. It just kept growing. With growth came responsibility, and the chance to build something bigger than myself. I started hiring carefully, handpicking people who reminded me of who I used to be, hungry, overlooked, and ready to fight for something real. I didn't want resumes filled with privilege. I wanted scars, stories, and drive. That's how I met Elena, my future CFO. She'd been working as a part-time accountant at a small logistics firm. underpaid and overqualified. When I saw the precision and passion in her freelance proposal, I called her that night. "I can't offer you luxury yet," I told her, "but I can offer you a mission." She laughed softly. "I'm not looking for luxury," she said. "I'm looking for purpose." From the first day she joined, Elena became the anchor I never knew I needed. She handled numbers like an artist, turning chaos into clarity. Where I saw pressure, she saw structure. Where I hesitated, she executed. She'd come in early, leave late, and always challenge me, not out of doubt, but belief. "We're not playing to survive anymore," she'd remind me. "We're playing to lead." Our team became a family, the kind I'd always wanted. We shared takeout dinners in the office, celebrated small wins with cheap champagne, and laughed at the absurdity of chasing big dreams with little sleep. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Every success was earned. Every failure was shared. Sometimes, late at night, I'd stand by the glass wall of our small but growing workspace, watching the lights of other startups flicker across the city. I'd think about how far I'd come from that damp studio apartment, from the car that once served as my bed. There was no father's shadow here, no hierarchy to climb, just momentum. One evening, after another long day, Elena caught me staring at our logo on the wall. "You realize this is just the beginning, right?" she said, half smiling. I nodded, the words catching in my throat. "Yeah," I said quietly, "but it's the first time the beginning doesn't feel like the end." We didn't know it then, but Bridgeworks was about to outgrow its name, its space, and everything we'd imagined possible. But that night, as I turned off the office lights, I allowed myself one small moment of pride, because for the first time, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was running toward it. It was a gray Tuesday morning, the kind that usually blurs into all the others. We were in the middle of our weekly strategy meeting, half drained on caffeine and deadlines, when Elena's phone buzzed. Normally, she ignored calls during work, but this time she froze. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then to me. "It's them," she whispered. She stepped out to take the call, leaving the room humming with nervous silence. My team continued talking, but I couldn't focus. My heart pounded like it used to before final exams, before every moment when life split in two directions. 10 minutes later, the door opened, and Elena returned, her usual calm replaced with a quiet, shaking grin. "They want to take us public," she said. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "Public?" I repeated, my voice barely audible. She nodded, still in disbelief. "The board's pushing for an IPO. They think we're ready." The room went dead quiet. Then, as her words sank in, it erupted. Laughter, gasps, spontaneous clapping. I just stood there, unable to move. An IPO. 3 letters that meant everything had changed. As the noise around me blurred, I sat back, feeling time fold in on itself. Graduation day came rushing back like a ghost, the crowd cheering, the air thick with joy I didn't feel. The moment my phone buzzed with my father's text, "Don't expect help from me anymore." "You're on your own." He'd meant it as a punishment, a declaration that I'd been cut off, forgotten. But now, years later, sitting at the head of a table surrounded by people who believed in me, I realized how wrong he'd been. Being on my own was the best thing that ever happened to me. Elena's voice broke through my thoughts. "We need your decision, boss. They'll expect a preliminary statement today." Boss. That word still sounded foreign coming from her, from anyone. I looked at my team. The same people who once shared cup noodles with me, who'd stayed when investors didn't. Their faces were glowing with pride, with faith. I took a breath, steadying the storm inside me. "Let's do it," I said. "Let's take Bridgeworks public." Cheers erupted again, but I barely heard them. My mind was already spiraling into the meaning of it all, the sheer magnitude of what we were about to do. The IPO wasn't just a financial milestone, it was vindication. The world that once dismissed me was now buying shares in my dream. That afternoon, after the meeting, I found myself alone in my office. The city skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass. My phone lay on the desk, silent, heavy with history. For the first time in years, I felt an urge to text my father. To tell him, not in anger, but in fact, you were wrong, but I didn't. Instead, I opened the old graduation photo on my laptop. Me, in a wrinkled gown, smiling for the camera while he stood just out of frame. Back then, that picture had symbolized distance. Now it looked like proof of freedom. The IPO announcement came days later. Reporters called. Analysts speculated. Numbers climbed higher than we ever projected. Overnight, I became the youngest self-made CEO in the region, a label that meant less to me than anyone knew. What mattered wasn't the valuation. It was the reclamation. That night, after the final confirmation came in from the underwriters, Elena texted me, "You realize you're officially wealthier than your dad ever dreamed, right?" I stared at her message for a long time before replying, "It's not about being richer. It's about finally being free." Then I set my phone down, looked out at the glittering skyline, and let out a slow breath. The boy who once begged for his father's pride was gone. In his place stood a man who'd built his own name, not for revenge, but for redemption. The news spread faster than wildfire. Within days of the IPO announcement, my phone became a magnet for congratulatory messages, interviews, and investors who'd once ghosted me now calling to reconnect. But amid the chaos, one name on my screen froze me completely. Dad. I hadn't seen that word flash across my phone in nearly 7 years. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake, maybe an old contact sinking from the cloud. But when I picked up, that familiar gravelly voice filled the line, calm and almost rehearsed. "Son," he said, "I saw the news. Congratulations." There was a pause, the kind that feels like a knife twisting in silence. He continued before I could respond. "You've done well. I'm proud of you. Proud." The same man who told me I'd never manage my life. The same man who laughed when I showed him my prototype. Now suddenly proud. I leaned back in my chair, forcing a smile that he couldn't see. "Thanks, Dad. It's been a long road." He chuckled softly. "Well, you know how I always said you had potential? I guess you proved me right." I almost laughed. He'd rewritten history so easily, painting himself as the wise mentor instead of the man who abandoned me at graduation. But I didn't correct him. I didn't need to. That was the strange power of success. It silences explanations. He talked for a while, asking about the company, about where I lived now. Then came the shift, that subtle pivot from praise to purpose. "You know," he said, "your brother's been struggling. The market downturn hit him hard. Maybe you could offer him a position? He's family after all." There it was. The real reason for his call. Not pride, not love, a request. My chest tightened, but my voice stayed even. "I'll think about it," I said simply. He sounded relieved, mistaking my calm for compliance. "That's my boy. I always knew you'd come through for the family. The family. The same one that left me out of every photo, every trip, every story that mattered." I didn't feel anger anymore, just a quiet ache. Like looking at an old scar and realizing it doesn't hurt, but it will never fade either. When the call ended, I sat for a long time, staring at the city below. Part of me wanted to slam the phone down, to scream that I owed them nothing. But another part of me, the wiser, colder part, whispered that silence was stronger than rage. Over the next few days, it wasn't just him. My inbox filled with distant relatives, cousins who'd mocked me for chasing dreams, aunts who'd called me ungrateful for leaving. Each message dripped with sudden affection. "So proud of you. We always knew you'd make it. Your father talks about you all the time." They had rewritten the past collectively, polishing away their cruelty like it had never existed. I replied politely to each one. Short, kind, emotionless. "Thank you for the message. I appreciate it. That's all." Inside, I felt a storm brewing, not of anger, but of anticipation. This wasn't revenge, not yet. It was the quiet before it. That weekend, I agreed to a family dinner. My father insisted. "It's time to reconnect," he said warmly. "We're proud of you, son. The whole family is." As I hung up, I stared at my reflection in the office window. Older, steadier, unrecognizable from the boy who once begged for approval. I realized that I wasn't walking back into their world as the outcast anymore. I was walking in as the reckoning. For years, I'd imagined what I'd say if I ever saw him again, how I'd confront him for every cruel word, every cold look. But now I didn't want confrontation. I wanted composure, because nothing unsettles the powerful like calm control from the one they once broke. I turned off the lights in my office and smiled faintly. The dinner was set for Sunday, and for the first time, I wasn't the one seeking a seat at their table. The night of the dinner, the air carried that strange mix of nostalgia and nausea, the scent of expensive cologne and hypocrisy. I drove up to my father's house, the same house I once wasn't welcome in, only now it looked smaller somehow. The driveway was packed with cars. My brother's Tesla gleamed beside Dad's new Mercedes, both parked proudly at angles meant to be seen. When I stepped inside, chatter stopped for a moment. Faces turned. Smiles stretched, a little too wide. My father approached with open arms, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. There he is, my son, the genius who took my advice and made it big. Applause, laughter, cameras. I shook his hand instead of hugging him. Good to see you, Dad, I said softly. The words tasted metallic, like restraint. We moved to the long dining table, polished until I could see my reflection in it. Every seat was filled with family members who once forgot my birthday, who called me a failure behind closed doors. Now they clinked glasses in my honor, their compliments sweet and rehearsed. Dinner began with stories, or rather, his stories. I remember when he was a boy, Dad said, grinning. I told him, son, discipline is everything. Look how he listened. Built an empire from my lessons. Laughter erupted, nods circled the table. Even my brother chimed in with, yeah, Dad always had the best advice. I smiled politely, cutting my steak slowly, savoring the silence between his lies. I could have corrected him. I could have reminded them how he'd laughed at my dream, how he'd texted don't expect help the day I graduated. But that would have given him power, the power of my reaction. Instead, I looked him in the eyes and said lightly, you did teach me one thing, Dad. The table hushed a little. Never wait for anyone to believe in you. Sometimes silence is the best motivation, he chuckled, mistaking the truth for a compliment. Exactly. That's what I meant all along. The room erupted in forced agreement. I sipped my wine, letting the warmth of irony wash over me. Every toast that followed felt like a performance. The audience pretending, the actor unaware that his script was transparent. When dessert arrived, Dad stood up again, tapping his glass. Everyone, I just want to say how proud I am. My son carried forward the family legacy. I almost laughed. What legacy? A legacy of neglect, of picking favorites, of teaching me love through absence. But I didn't speak. I didn't need to, because I noticed the CFO, my closest friend, sitting quietly at the other end of the table. He caught my eye and gave a subtle nod. That was the moment I knew. Tomorrow, the truth would no longer need my voice. The IPO was scheduled to go public, and with it, the official filings would list every founder, every shareholder, every name that mattered, and his wasn't one of them. The dinner dragged on with endless small talk and shallow affection. I played the part. The polite, successful son, smiling for photos and nodding at backhanded compliments. Inside, though, I felt something new, not revenge exactly, something quieter, like watching a tide rise slowly, knowing it will eventually reach every corner of the shore. As the night ended, Dad clasped my shoulder by the door. You've made me proud, he said again, softer this time. Maybe we should talk about working together. Family business, right? I met his eyes, steady and unblinking. Sure, Dad, I said. Let's talk, soon. He smiled, satisfied with the illusion. But as I walked to my car, the night air felt cleaner than it ever had before. Because for the first time, I wasn't the one seeking approval. He was. And tomorrow, when the world saw the IPO announcement, when the headlines read my name and not his, that would be the real dinner. The next morning felt like standing at the edge of a cliff I'd built myself, every stone laid with rejection, humiliation, and sleepless nights. My phone buzzed endlessly as reporters confirmed attendance. Investors congratulated me. and the press called the IPO the most anticipated tech debut of the year. But beneath all that noise was one thought pulsing like a heartbeat. He'll be there. The event was held at a downtown hotel ballroom, its walls lined with cameras, glass podiums, and LED backdrops displaying my company's logo. I'd worn the same watch I'd bought during my hunger years, scratched, faded, but real. A reminder of where I came from. When I stepped onto the stage, the sound hit like thunder, applause, flashes, the murmuring sea of journalists and shareholders. My CFO stood off to the side, giving me a quiet nod. "Good morning," I began, gripping the podium. "Today isn't just about numbers or valuation. It's about endurance. The kind that starts when the world tells you no and you decide to say yes anyway." The crowd hushed, their energy shifting as I spoke. I wasn't reading a script. This was muscle memory. Every wound, every sleepless night carved into my voice. There were times, I continued, when even family turned their backs. When silence was louder than support. But those moments, they teach you who you are. In the third row, I saw him. My father. He sat perfectly still in a press suit, jaw tight, pretending composure. My brother sat beside him, half proud, half confused. For a second, our eyes met, and I saw the flicker of realization behind his stare. I let a faint smile tug at my lips and went on. "So today I want to thank a few people, the ones who believed when no one else did." I paused. The silence stretched. Cameras clicked. My former professor, who introduced me to our first investor. The professor smiled, visibly emotional. My CFO, who worked beside me when the company couldn't even afford coffee. Applause. And the strangers, the ones who showed kindness when I was sleeping in my car and didn't even know my name. Another pause. My eyes found him again. "And to those who doubted me," I said softly, "thank you too. You were my greatest teachers. You showed me exactly what I never want to become." The applause started slow, then built into a roar. I looked out over the sea of faces, but my gaze lingered where it began. My father's hands were clasped tightly, his smile brittle. He understood now. The speech wasn't for him. It was about him. As the cameras flashed, I felt the strange electric calm of closure. Not triumph, not revenge, something cleaner. The kind of peace that comes when the past can no longer reach you. After the speech, I stepped backstage. My CFO clapped my shoulder. "You did it," he said, grinning. "You burned the house down, and you didn't even have to raise your voice." I laughed, the kind of laugh that shakes free years of silence. "No need," I said. "The truth speaks loud enough now." Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, questions spilling. But amid the chaos, I spotted him walking out the side door. Alone. No entourage, no cameras. Just a man who finally had to live with the echo of his own words. "Don't expect help from me anymore." As he reached the curb, I called out softly. He froze, turned. "Dad," I said, approaching slowly. "You were right, you know. I didn't get help. I didn't need it." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For once, he had nothing to teach, nothing to claim. I offered my hand. He hesitated, then shook it. His grip was weak, unsure. Mine was steady. "Congratulations," he muttered, eyes downcast. "Thank you," I said simply. Then, before turning away, I added, "I learned everything I needed to from you." As I walked toward the waiting car, cameras still flashing behind me, I realized this was the real victory. Not the wealth, not the IPO, but the quiet dignity of having built a life that no longer required permission to exist. For years, I'd dreamed of proving him wrong. But standing there, the weight of it gone, I saw the truth. I hadn't proven him wrong. I'd simply proven myself right, and that was enough. The night after the IPO felt surreal, the city below my penthouse glowing like a constellation I'd finally reached. The noise had faded, the cameras gone, the champagne finished. My phone buzzed endlessly on the counter, notifications stacking like trophies. Congratulations, offers, interviews. But one name froze me mid-step. Dad, it was late, almost midnight. The screen glowed with his message. Proud of you, son. 3 simple words, too small to hold the weight of everything that came before them. I stood there for a long time, staring at the text, wondering what he was thinking when he typed it. Maybe guilt, maybe pride disguised as apology, or maybe it was just another performance, one final attempt to edit the past. I sat down, thumb hovering over the keyboard, but instead of replying, I scrolled up. Slowly, through the years of silence, until I reached that old message. Don't expect help from me anymore. You're on your own. There it was. Graduation day, the text that had burned itself into my memory like a scar. I remembered exactly where I was when it came through. The noise of cheering families around me, the empty bleachers where he should have been sitting, the way my heart sank as I pretended not to care. And now, here he was again, reaching out when it no longer mattered, when I no longer needed him. I stared at the 2 messages sitting on my screen, one born of cruelty, one wrapped in regret, and felt an odd calm settle over me. There was no anger left, no longing, just clarity. I typed slowly, each word deliberate. Didn't need it. I reread it once, twice. Short, final. Then I hit send. The message went through instantly, the tiny delivered mark appearing like a full stop at the end of a long, painful chapter. For a moment I waited, expecting another reply, an explanation maybe, a defense, but nothing came. Just silence, the same silence that had once crushed me, now transformed into peace. I muted the chat, scrolled up one last time, then archived it. Gone. I walked out onto the balcony, the night air cool against my face. Below, the city pulsed with life, taxis crawling like fireflies, skyscrapers gleaming like altars to persistence. Somewhere in that glow was every sleepless night, every insult I turned into fuel, every version of me that refused to quit. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't look. I'd spent too many years chasing words from people who'd already told me who they were. Tonight, I wasn't chasing anything. I looked up at the sky, half laughing at how quiet it all felt. There was no orchestra, no thunderclap of victory, just the steady rhythm of breathing without bitterness. Success hadn't erased the pain. It had simply put it in perspective. My father's text wasn't a doorway back into the past. It was a mirror showing me how far I'd walked from it. Inside, I set the phone face down, poured myself a glass of water, and let the silence fill the room. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. I thought back to that kid sitting alone at graduation, humiliated, ignored, pretending he didn't care. If I could tell him anything now, it wouldn't be about revenge or success. It would be simple. You were always enough. They just couldn't see it. Outside, the city kept shining, as if to remind me, light doesn't need permission to exist. And for the first time in my life, neither did I. The day I got the keys, I didn't feel the rush I expected. No fireworks, no swelling pride. Just a quiet hum inside my chest, like something finally aligning after years of imbalance. The house sat on a hill overlooking the city, its wide windows catching the sunrise. It reminded me of my father's home, the one that had always felt more like a museum of pride than a place to belong. But this one was different. The first thing I did was open every curtain. Let the light in. I wanted no shadows here, no corners where shame or silence could hide. The walls were still bare. The air still smelled of new paint. But it already felt alive, not because of its size, but because of what it represented. A space built from truth, not appearances. As I walked through each room, I thought of my younger self, the boy who used to press his ear to the door, hoping to be invited inside, the one who mistook approval for love. Now I was the one holding the keys, and all I could think about was how many others were still standing outside, waiting for a door to open. That thought stayed with me for weeks. When the IPO profits cleared, everyone expected me to buy something extravagant, a yacht, a villa, another company. Instead, I started something smaller, something closer to the heart. A mentorship program for kids who had dreams but no one to believe in them. The first day we opened applications, Hundreds poured in, stories written in desperation and hope. Teenagers coding in library basements, single mothers trying to finish degrees, quiet kids who'd been told they were too much or not enough. Every line felt like a piece of my own past speaking back to me. I called it the Open Door Initiative. Because that's what I'd needed most. Not money, not advice, just someone to open a door and say, "You belong here." Soon our office was buzzing again. Not with investors this time, but with laughter, mistakes, and beginnings. Watching those kids learn, fail, and rise again filled something inside me that no success ever could. It was strange, how the same pain that once broke me had become the blueprint for something healing. One afternoon, I stood in my new living room, surrounded by photos from our first mentorship group. Smiling faces, handwritten notes of thanks, their energy spilling from every frame. I realized this was the difference between my father's house and mine. His had been built to impress. Mine was built to welcome. I poured myself a coffee and walked out onto the porch as the sun dipped low. From here I could see the whole city, the glass towers, the traffic veins, the pulse of life that once seemed so far away. I'd spent years chasing success to prove I was enough. Now, I wanted to spend the rest of my life proving others were too. My phone buzzed with another notification. A news article titled, "The CEO Who Turned His Pain into Purpose." I smiled, not because of the headline, but because for once, it wasn't about revenge or redemption. It was about creation. I took a deep breath, the air cool against the warmth of dusk, and whispered to the quiet house. We made it. And for the first time, the echo that came back didn't sound hollow. It sounded like home. The city never really sleeps. Even at midnight, it hums. A soft, electric lullaby of engines, voices, and the distant pulse of ambition. I stood on my balcony, barefoot, a glass of water in my hand, watching the skyline shimmer like a living thing, the same skyline I used to stare at from parking lots and bus stops, wondering if I'd ever be part of it. Now, it looked back at me. The air was cool, threaded with the scent of rain. Down below, traffic lights blinked in rhythm, and somewhere, a siren wailed. A reminder that life keeps moving, no matter who notices or doesn't. I leaned against the railing, breathing it all in. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was trying to catch up to anything. I was simply here. People talk about revenge like it's fire, hot, consuming, dramatic. But standing there, I realized it's quieter than that. True revenge isn't about making someone hurt. It's about becoming untouchable by the things that once broke you. I thought about my father again, the sound of his voice at that dinner, so sure, so performative. I imagined him now, probably sitting in his study, maybe still trying to make sense of what happened. Maybe still rehearsing new versions of the past where he'd been the guiding hand instead of the weight I had to lift. And yet, I didn't feel anger. Not anymore, just distance, the kind that no apology or recognition could bridge. He gave me nothing. No encouragement, no safety net, no belief. And for a long time I resented him for that. But now, under the hush of the night sky, I understood something profound. His absence had been the catalyst. The void he left became the space I learned to fill myself. Every cruel word, every cold shoulder, every time he looked through me instead of at me, they became bricks in the foundation of who I am. Without realizing it, he taught me the one lesson that outlasted all his others. You build your own worth. A breeze swept through, carrying the faint sound of laughter from somewhere below. It reminded me of the kids from the mentorship program, how their eyes lit up when they realized they could create something that mattered. That sound, that energy, had more meaning than every applause I'd ever received. Freedom wasn't in the IPO. It wasn't in the headlines or the house or the wealth. It was in moments like this, standing alone but never lonely, no longer waiting for permission to feel proud. I finished my drink, set the glass down on the railing, and looked out once more at the city. Every light was a story, every story a climb, and in that mosaic of motion and silence, I saw myself. Not the boy who was left behind, not the man proving a point, but someone whole, unshaken, finally free. A single phrase rose to the surface of my mind, so simple and steady that it felt like the truth I'd been chasing all along. He gave me nothing. And that's how I learned to build everything. The words lingered in the air, soft but unbreakable, like a secret between me and the night. Below, the city lights kept burning, bright, unbothered, eternal, and so did I.